So, everybody, welcome to the public lecture of the Lithuanian Society for the Study of Religion. And today we'll talk about Muslims in Europe. Muslim migrants occupied imagination of many Europeans and Lithuanians in recent years. But the question is how the image we have about Muslim migrants and their Islams match the diversity of Muslim migrants. Then Lithuania is famous for its attention to human rights violations, although usually violations that happened elsewhere. And one disaster of human rights mostly remains unnoticed in both in Lithuanian discourse and in European discourse. So today I invite you to learn more about the diversity of Muslim migrants of Islam, and to learn about one Muslim movement of Turkish background mostly, but known throughout the world. And although members of the Gülen or Hizmet movement have lived in Europe for years, their numbers increased significantly after 2016 failed coup in Turkey. Today we'll talk about this Gülen or Hizmet movement and how it changed after the coup, and how communities related to the movement developed in European countries, including Eastern Europe and Lithuania. And we'll have two speakers. First one, Dr. Ismail Mesut Sezgin from Regent's Park College, University of Oxford, who is also a member of the movement himself and a representative of Hizmet community in the UK, and the director of Center for Hizmet Studies based in the UK. Ismail Sezgin will present the movement and its development after the failed coup attempt, and including current resettlement of the movement in Europe and Muslim communities. Later, Professor Egdūnas Račius from Vytautas Magnus University will comment on the Turkish Islam within landscape of Islam in Eastern Europe. Finally, I hope we will end today's event with a discussion when you'll be able to ask your questions, and at the same time you can put your questions anytime on the chat. And during the presentations, I would like to ask you to mute yourselves. And now I think we can start. Ismail, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Eglė. Let's start with a correction. I'm not representative of Hizmet in the UK, but let me share my screen. Is everything okay with the screen share? Can you see the presentation?
Yes, yes, it's okay.
Okay, that's fine. Again, thank you very much. I'm not representative of Hizmet movement in the UK. I am just a member of the Hizmet movement, and I have done a PhD on the very foundation of Hizmet movement I would say the core moral responsibility understanding. If I'm not wrong, I have 40 minutes more or less to do this talk, and I haven't rehearsed this, so I hope I can stand by with the timer. And there is too much to cover, so let me start immediately. I'll be talking about a bit of because of the audience is not necessarily familiar with the particulars of what is a Hizmet movement, what is different from an Islamic movement, what's happening in Turkey. I will try to make an introductory definition of Hizmet movement, its principles, a short history of Hizmet movement, and we'll try to talk about the ongoing crisis in Turkey about the Hizmet movement, if that's okay. And hopefully that will be bring us to Q&A session. Now, the content would be, of course, we'll talk about what is Hizmet movement, its definition, its principles, emergence of the movement from a mosque congregation to a social movement that we are talking today, relevant to, let's say, Lithuania and other countries. And of course, what has happened in the 15th of July and its implications. Sorry, this might be a bit misleading. It's not necessarily what has happened in 15th of July, which we can discuss in the Q&A, but I will try to talk about how 15th of July has affected what exactly happened with the coup attempt in Turkey. So, I happen to see. Okay, that's fine. So, in terms of what is Hizmet movement, last time I have discussed this with a group of Tanzanian young graduates, and all 20 of them actually came up with a different definition. So they are familiar with Hizmet movement, they have a definition of Hizmet movement, and then we discussed the 21st definition. And this definition is basically from my thesis about the movement, and it's based on Fethullah Gülen and the way the person who inspired Hizmet movement and his definition. So, first of all, what is Hizmet movement? Hizmet movement is a religiously inspired social movement which works around education, dialogue, and charity activities, which I will explain. In the meantime, if you can mute people who you know, like if there is any other host, help me to mute people so I don't have to deal with that. Thank you very much, but sometimes people may mistakenly leave their mics on. Anyway, so, but how that what we call Gülen movement or Hizmet movement came to be an education, dialogue, and charity-oriented social movement from a mosque. It happened with a definition, actually, and Gülen's definition is something is called a Hizmet, and that is mainly, let's say, promotion of moral values or good moral values or universal moral values, at least Islamic moral values, however you take it, that requires a separate definition. But actually the way you do that makes the difference within the other movements, or which allows us to differentiate Hizmet movement from the other movements. One of them is it should be compliant with the understanding of present time. Actually, the first one, according to Gülen, is Hizmet movement, anything to be called Hizmet, it should be compliant with the understanding of the present time. This is what makes the movement a bit more modern oriented, meaning like the way it is understanding or implementation of Islam is a bit more modern, a bit more relevant, a bit more living in today. So anything that you do in the name of Hizmet should be okay or compliant with the understanding of the present current time. And the second thing in the definition, he highlights that it should, all Hizmet, all service, again, Hizmet means service, should be carried out according to Quranic principles of being just, fair, moderate, and consistent. These are the most repeated attributes in the Quran. So it has to be compliant with the Quranic principles of those principles and other Quranic principles as well. And the third one is to say, Gülen say, to avoid conflict with people who are working for the same cause, which means, like, for instance, Gülen is defining a movement where spending time with conflict, even that if that is related with other people who are trying to do something else, you know, who can be your competitors or your rivals, you shouldn't go into conflict with them or contradiction with them or fight with them and waste energy in that sense. But you shouldn't also waste energy in terms of with frictions within the movement or with similar kind people or with similar minded people, because all friction causes a waste of energy, and that energy should be used positively. It's called positive contribution. Everything you should do everything you do should contribute positively for your cause, for your aims, for your objectives. So whilst you're doing that, you should avoid as much as possible from conflict with others and friction with your brothers. Let's say in a shorter term we can put it together. And another Hizmet principles is that Gülen says that Hizmet should be logical and reasonable. It can be two different issues, but whatever you decide to do in the name of Hizmet as a service, it should be logical, it should be explained, it should make sense, and it should be reasonable. And again, this makes Hizmet a bit more realistic on the ground. And it also asks to be focused rather than try to achieve everything at once. So Hizmet people, you would find them working around projects rather than trying to do everything overall all the time, because that is within the very definition of Hizmet movement. And then also Gülen also thinks that any service should utilize the resources, seize the opportunities, and try to solve the problems of today with wisdom. So there is a trust in or faith in God that tomorrow's problems will come with their own resources. So we should use today's resources and seize every opportunity that we have today to solve the problems of today, because that is our responsibility, to solve the problems of today. And also, whilst we're doing that, that's the other principle is to utilize resources in the most efficient way. This ideally makes the Hizmet movement, you know, as a definition, whilst we're doing this, also promoting the moral values within these criteria. But whilst we're doing that, Hizmet movement had a number of principles emerged that you see they act or abide by those principles. And those principles, when you look at them closely, they are actually sourced either from religious sources or historical sources or contextual sources. So I'll give some examples for this part to make it a bit more understandable, but we can think of them like the graph that I drove for this purpose is like concentric circles. In the very center of the Hizmet movement is the religious sources of principles, which I will give some explanation. That actually makes Hizmet movement Islamically originated or originated from Islam. But its actions might be a bit outside of the Islamic or religious sphere. It doesn't have to necessarily always remain in there. But there is a huge amount of historical sources that has influenced, especially the methods, the way of thinking, the way of acting of Hizmet people. And then finally, the contextual sources. I try to make this a bit more, let's say, appealing to eye, let's say. First of all, when we say Islamic principles, at the core of Hizmet movement, there is that to abide the Quranic principles, that, you know, to stay away whatever Quran prohibit, like gossiping or killing or stealing from others or doing other wrong things, and also do whatever Quran or Islam ask a Muslim to do, like being just and fair to others, help the poor, feed the hungry, and all other good actions. So this is why we have to always remember that Hizmet movement, in the core of it, is a religious movement. It does everything for the sake of God, to please him, because he expressed himself in the Quran or via the other holy books, that he wishes to see us doing all these good things and avoid all those bad actions. And at the core of Hizmet movement, This is about all those principles that you can find summaries on the internet, that what Quran asks, like for instance, have establish a good relationship with relatives, not to cut ties with others. Anyway, so this is the first part, and the second, this is a bit more chunkier area where I can actually talk and give examples, maybe 10, or specifically I'll try to give examples, because this is where Hizmet movement is a Turkish movement, or a post-Ottoman movement, in a different time, however you frame it. You can see that a lot of principles that actually defines how something is being done, how something is being achieved, what methods should be used, or what motivations or what principles to apply, is very much based on some historical figures, and they're saying some Turkish proverbs, some Turkish historical facts, and other stuff. In the big picture, you can see the famous Sufi poet Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi, or in short, Rumi. For instance, Rumi has a huge influence on Hizmet movement, although he's a Persian writer, or some even claim he's Persian, but he has a huge influence in Turkey in terms of his legacy. And one of that is, for instance, that it makes sense for a lot of people when they are fundraising, is you can see they often quote one of his poetry where he says, people should be generous like rivers, and humble like earth, and be like a night when covering the mistakes. Sort of in these various attributes, but about the generosity, when in giving, be like river, Rumi says, and it makes sense for a lot of Turkish people who is in a fundraising sohbet or a gathering, where the person who is trying to convince people to support certain projects brings out this principle from Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi, and then you shall give like a river is flowing, and be very generous, because there is no calculation, there is no holding back in a river's flow and stuff. But it may not make the same impact on, let's say, an Indian Islamic, let's say a Deobandi Islamic understanding, because what you have to give is prescribed in Islam. You don't have to give more than that. It's better if you give more than that, but it's very much measured, and the Ramadan is coming in the next month, and what you have to give is 2.5% of your surplus wealth, anything apart from your essentials, and that is well calculated, and zakat is this and this is that. So that may not necessarily translate in every culture very successfully, but this is where Hizmet movement, and it is, let's say, heritage of giving comes from Rumi's principle, and it is very much recited among the members of Hizmet movement to explain or to encourage each other to do some good deed or support certain activities. So Rumi is one of the most quoted person in both Nursi's and mainly Fethullah Gülen's articles. So we'll come back to that. But there is another in the right top corner. The old gentleman is Said Nursi. Said Nursi is actually maybe the most influential person on today's Hizmet movement, apart from Fethullah Gülen. He just lived in the early Republican era when Atatürk was alive, and when the late Ottoman period and early Republican era. And he has seen many wars and many other problems. And he has principles that shaped Hizmet movement a lot. Like, for instance, you shall always seek the pleasure of God. In every action, you should seek the pleasure of God. You shall know your strength in your sincerity, not in your numbers. And many other principles, like every other week, a Hizmet member should be constantly reading. I think there is 10 principles like that, but throughout his books, he has so many ways that teaches people how to approach or how to understand Islam. And one of the ones that I like a lot, for instance, he says, it is a good deed to increase someone's love for God, but it is also a good deed to decrease someone's hatred towards God or religion, or however you see it, or you can take it in any topic. He doesn't only see that any positive action that results in increasing the popularity of a topic or an issue, or in this case religion or God, but also decreasing that or decreasing that hatred among groups or people is a good deed. So, for instance, let's say talk about dialogue. Dialogue is not, according to this principle, only aims to increase the love between communities. It also is dialogue when you decrease the hatred between communities. So that's a good way of looking at it, and that actually is one of the well-known principles that Hizmet people remind each other about. And Yunus Emre is similar. He has lived in similar times with the Rumi, and he has a huge poetry that people keep reciting in terms of, for instance, the non-violence reaction is very much affected by Yunus Emre and his way of seeing it. In one poetry, he put it down, he is armless when he is hit, he can't hit back. The dervish that Yunus Emre defines can't hit back other people, or when he's cursed, he's tongueless, he can't curse people back. So the reaction is very peaceful, non-violent, in fact, non-reactionary in many times. But there is so many poetries that any common Turkish person would know, and when you recite, it's almost like pushing a button in his historical luggage, and he would understand an issue in a different way. So this part really affected how Hizmet operates. Of course, I haven't mentioned a lot of other sources. These are the most notable people, but there are proverbs, the way of thinking Turkish, the way of timekeeping as a Turkish, the way of prioritizing things according to Turkish people. All these things has affected, at least up to now, the current model that is in front of us as Hizmet movement. So these are historical principles, and there is a huge list of them. I think I have listed almost 40 of them as an example, and from various other places. There is some from Alvarlı Efe, which is Fethullah Gülen's teacher, and he has some poetry that defines humility and other stuff, and people actually express themselves via that poetical, almost not claims, but what would be the right word? That poetry-based axioms, almost like people assume these are correct, they don't challenge these sayings and poetry. So this has a lot of effect. And the last one is contextual principles. So I will move from here how actually Hizmet movement adopted or responded, or people in 1960s and 70s responded to social crisis around themselves and emerged what we call today's Hizmet movement. But it mainly gives a huge area at the end, apart from your Islamic motivation, your cultural heritage, your historical heritage and principles and luggage, however you take it, sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. In the practical operation of things and on the field, you have to always follow what context is and what is needed. For instance, in certain places, the hunger is a big problem, and you try to solve that. In some places, let's say, xenophobia is a big problem, you encourage dialogue. In some places, war is a problem, and you try to promote peace. And in some other places, ignorance is the biggest problem, you try to promote education. In fact, Said Nursi make these sort of a big claim that the biggest problem at that time, in his time, was ignorance, poverty, and discrimination. And any good action, any Hizmet should actually try to eradicate that. Any good Muslim should try to work to resolve these issues. And nowadays, these are changing, and you can see that debate is shifting within even Hizmet movement as well. Like environmental issues are a big issue, so people think that it has to be part of it. Very recently, a notable Hizmet institution declared a new set of principles, and it's the biggest emphasis on human rights, and that is understandable for various reasons. Now, this is the last part. And it differs in Lithuania, whatever the society and whatever the context in there, people try to be relevant and helpful and solve whatever they see a problem, or at least contribute to solution of any problem they see. Of course, there is a huge template of this ignorance, poverty, and discrimination related topics, which we call dialogue, education, and charity activities. But when it comes to particulars of an application, you will see, let's say, any Hizmet school would be operating within the law of the country according to their needs and according to their regulations. Now, I'll try to take it a bit of history of Hizmet movement. So I am at the 20 minutes, so I'll try to spend as much as little time as possible to move on and give some more time for Q&A. So this is where it's all started, you know, although Fethullah Gülen has a time where he served before his military service in Edirne, we often take at the beginning of his Hizmet movement is back to this mosque where he was stationed as an imam, and he was also a teacher for a Quranic school, a madrasa, at a religious school nearby, attached to this mosque, and where he raised his first pupils, some of them are which is still with him. And also, I choose this picture. Also, this mosque was within community. He was engaging and trying to be in touch with the local shopkeepers and other people and try to bring them in. Or if they don't come, he used to go to them, and he was positively engaging a young, ambitious, or idealist imam at that time. So Kestane Pazarı in Izmir, the most western part of the Turkey, from a very, very different background where Gülen came from, which is almost the most eastern part of Turkey. In fact, the most eastern, one of the most eastern borders of Turkey. Gülen, after his military service in his station, he tried to engage the problems of the people, the grassroots on the community in there. And one of those problems in 5 to 10 years, apart from giving good speeches, integrating religion and science together, and addressing the current topics like evolution and other issues, and in fact campaigning for, let's say, a green air, like he was famously known for setting up an anti-smoking campaign. He, in 1970s, realized there is a huge wave of urbanization. A lot of young kids from the villages, from the rural areas, coming to the cities to be educated, but they don't have support. They don't have support from their families. Not everyone is rich and wealthy from agriculture and stuff. A lot of poor people come and try their luck, and they need accommodation. So the very first social projects he undertook was to open dormitories for those kids who came from rural villages and their problem. What he did is he already knew people on the street, shopkeepers who wanted to do good stuff. And he said, why don't you just look after the students, open a dormitory, let them stay in a safe environment so they can become teachers and other, professions and be helpful to society. This is part of your religion and part of good deed as well. So that is what those people did. And then later on, these are not necessarily following, but if you see, this is the first episode, first journal, first the part of the a magazine, first unit, volume of the famous magazine called Sızıntı, and it is 1979, just before the 1980s. Gülen decided to have their own, establish their own media outlets, magazines and newspapers mainly. And later on, we see that, that means like he see a problem. Actually, the problem was everything was very political. If you remember, some of you might remember the Cold War era, everything was communist versus United capitalists and divided into two and stuff. So he wanted to establish a slightly less political, but bring science and religion together in a magazine, so he had to establish his own magazine, which survived until the coup and until it has been shut down by the government, and probably most copies are destroyed. And so he saw a need, and he addressed that need by opening a new channel in there, let's say. Later on, in 1980s, some of you will remember Reagan or Thatcher times, where everything was getting out of government hands, privatization, private companies were encouraged and everything. At that time, Gülen had to, there was a coup in Turkey in 1980, and Gülen was warranted but by the military leaders of the coup. So he was effectively on the run. And he had a chance to see the whole country from a very different point of view, where he realized the ignorance is a big problem, and the Muslims should invest in opening secular schools to help mass education. So this was a radical idea for a religious group to open. Dormitories seems okay, but opening secular schools, not Islamic schools, not Imam Hatibs, not madrasas, but secular schools, was radical. But somehow that discussion has ended in favor of Gülen, and they set up secular schools. This is the very first school. And then later on, supplementary schools, which actually created a lot of upward social mobilization in Turkey. That is why we are having this big trouble in Turkey now, almost like a reaction to that upward social mobilization, which shouldn't have happened according to some people in Turkey. So now 1985, Gülen group or Hizmet movement has schools. They are seeing a problem in the country and they are responding to it. So later on, that media has developed into from, let's say, science and religious magazines into political newspapers, which is trying to give a different way of engaging with politics, or TV channels. Again, this is the right time to invest it, to go into that area. Famous Zaman newspaper, again shut down and by the current regime in Turkey. Anyway, in 1991, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, Gülen encouraged people to support I'm using this Turkish nationalistic way of explaining this, your brothers and sisters in the Central Asia. So there was an expansion in 1991 towards the Central Asia. Sorry about the typo in there. And so Gülen encouraged his followers to go and establish schools or businesses and other places, whatever those people need in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and other places. So this is the first time the movement become an international movement, or I would call it like transnational movement. And later, Gülen followed this in a few years later, when he retired from his position in the religious affairs as well. He moved this to in the Balkans. So there is a sense of like these people are under your care. When they were part of Ottoman, they were your brothers and sisters, so you should go and help them as well, not only Eastern brothers and sisters by your blood, but also by your culture. There are other brothers and sisters in the Balkan area, you should help them as well. So, and then it turns into a more global vision, but gradually people start to travel all around the world, and Hizmet movement in 2000 and onwards become actually chose an aim to be every country in the world if possible, and they managed to open schools and education institutions or businesses or charity organization or dialogue organization in 160 countries in the rest of the world. So this is the expansion and transnationalization of the movement. So the dialogue actually came in stages as well. So this is mainly what I talked so far was actually how from the dormitories, from the mosque to dormitories, from there to media and other parts, but mainly to education, and then the transnationalization with the education institutions. We have talked about that history, but now the dialogue actually came in slightly later. You know, in 1990s, there was a huge divide in Turkey, and Gülen tried to, in the right top corner, you see, tried to bridge the communities in Turkey by holding iftar or the fast-breaking dinners with different parts of the communities and try to bring them. There was especially a huge potential of an Alevi Sunni division in Turkey, and he tried to bridge that gap. Then he saw another gap, that the other religious minorities who are not accepted or not well known or not protected enough by Turkish population, because he's also now retired as a religious affairs officer, he doesn't feel like a government or a state bureaucrat. He actually feels more free. So he started to holding meetings with them, bringing them a bit more to the center of attention, and provide a little bit of acceptance. And with these activities and projects, we see that Gülen had even a meeting with Pope, which is a significant moment for the understanding of dialogue and what to expect from a dialogue, because at that time, the Catholic Church was changing their understanding of dialogue. It coincided in the right time, and it shaped and defined the 1995 and onwards, after that period, defined the Hizmet movement and it is engagement with the others all around the world. The dialogue become a main part of that issues. Then one other thing after that happened, the charity issues again, because most Hizmet people used to think charity, like helping people to educate themselves is the biggest form of charity. They used to collect scholarships for each student in need, and they used to give that money to those students, support them by providing dormitories or cheaper education or high quality education for free in certain circumstances. But the charity as we know it started until the big earthquake in Turkey as an organizational level. So one of the big shout when Turkey was hit by that big earthquake, people used to shout, "Is there anyone there?" And that becomes the title of a TV program in Hizmet TV channel first, and later a charity, and become a global charity foundation of its own that particularly was very active in the most needed parts according to whatever is the need. But let's say, so all these activities was continuing. Then the 15th of July, there has been a coup attempt in Turkey. There has been a coup attempt in Turkey, and in that coup attempt, a lot of things changed. I don't have a huge script about this for this part, but I at least want to start the conversation here because it's a huge information to process here. What happened is, whatever happened on that night, that was blamed for Gülen and his friends or the Hizmet movement, and they have been accused and persecuted for this coup attempt with their entirety. So there is a website. I'm not sure whether it's going to show, but I think it's a good idea to share. I will just quickly change this share screen for a moment, and so I can show you my screen as well. So when you look at this page, that is Turkey page, you can go and have a detailed look yourself. Okay. So what happened after the coup attempt is thousands of people are purged from mainly government positions. The estimation is that there is almost like 600,000 people have been investigated, and 150,000 people are dismissed from their state related jobs or public offices. 94,000, almost 95,000 people are arrested. These numbers are updated regularly. 3,000 schools and dormitories and universities and other education institutions are shut down. 6,000 academics, just higher education related jobs, are lost, meaning they were either purged or they were working in those institutions. 4,500 judges and prosecutors dismissed. 189 media outlets, big and small, are shut down. 319 journalists are arrested. So these are January to, at least a month old figures. And they have all the government decrees that individually these list all these people and their problems. And what happened is, I'll keep this screen on for a while. What happened is actually, on that night, there has been like 8,000 military personnel take part in military action. We don't know their motivation. According to British Parliament report, which I have had a chance to contribute to as well, it's a coalition of various groups in the army did something, but it was more, this is my part, it's not in British Parliament report, but it was more useful for Erdogan to use this as a way out for his own corruption allegations and other problems, and turn this into a scapegoat issue and blame his political rivals, especially Hizmet movement, and start persecuting people based on that affiliation. So a lot of people have been persecuted based on this affiliation, not necessarily because of they have committed any crime. What we call this has happened in a social purge, meaning like people, when they kicked out of their jobs, they weren't allowed to work in other private places as well. They weren't given health or health services for free as they were supposed to. They didn't necessarily have fair trials, and they're not necessarily having fair trials. This, again, most recently, British Home Office has done an updated report on these issues. Almost all detentions and arrests are unlawful, even according to Turkish law, because there isn't really a crime. The crime is based on, okay, you have used this Hizmet movement affiliated bank accounts, or you have a bank account in that bank, which was legal, no problem, or you were watching this TV channels, or you were subscribed to this journals or newspapers. All based on these affiliations, people being blamed of being part of a terrorist organization, not necessarily shown any reason or any specific action that took part. And we know there has been a systematic torture. It used to be peaking in terms of like really hard, brutal torture, but there is a huge amount of still torture and abuse of human rights, like not giving people enough time to prepare their defenses or all other related issues. And there is huge amount of trauma and suicide related victims in the from that period. I better share at this time my screen again, if you can. Okay, and my teacher, maths teacher, who was from a very poor background, managed to graduate from the top university of maths in Turkey. And the story is so sad. We used to know him because he was the legend among us. He taught us very well in high school. He used to eat people's leftovers. That is how of a low background he was. With this coup attempt, when he was purged, he tried to give private lessons and this and that, but there was a stigma attached to that being purged by the government decree. And there is so much propaganda and fear about it that he couldn't do. And what happened is, with a lot of families, they have divorced, maybe as a mean to try to separate trouble from the family, sort of a reason. And then with other financial constraints, and I don't know what else, I have heard that he commits suicide later on because of all these troubles and problems. He was a very bright mind, and I had actually took part when I was in high school to mock his teaching style in a theater of the high school, and he lent me his own jacket for it, so I can pretend like him. So he was such a nice person. He's among 657 or something, maybe increased now, people who commit suicide or killed under detention, or these are civilian people. These are almost bystanders to any issue that happened in Turkey, and a huge majority of people become refugees since then. So I am aware of my time, and sorry. Okay, and huge number of people become refugees, and that doesn't mean only from Turkey. In some Middle Eastern, Central Asian, and African countries where Erdogan used legal, illegal means to abduct people and bring them to Turkey to boost his political support, a lot of people from those places had to migrate from Western democracies as well, much safer places. A lot of people have their passports finished and the government or Turkish state refused to replace them, make them effectively stateless. A lot of people have their children who doesn't still have passports of their own country. If they manage to come to a safe place, they might have some sort of a maybe identification now. So there is other impacts which I am not totally prepared. Like for instance, there is huge decrease in nationalism. What I talked about, for instance, earlier, a huge part of this movement was about that. You know, and there is a huge number of you know, decrease in social stature. There is a shift in mindsets in the people. There is an inclination towards from transnational movement to a more global movement, but these are on the very early stages of the transition. I think we can discuss all these issues as a Q&A session. Thank you very much for listening. I think that would be my presentation, and hope this was in any way helpful.
Oh, thank you very much for your presentation. At least I'm sure that people, at least Lithuanians, who didn't know much about Hizmet, at least now will understand what kind of the movement the Hizmet movement is. And after the Hizmet movement moved to started settling in European countries and the US and other Western countries already before the coup attempt. But after the coup attempt, as I understand, large numbers moved to various, the UK, Germany, and other Western European countries. Eastern Europe is not the most interesting destination for Hizmet refugees. But nevertheless, we have a community in Lithuania as well as in other Eastern European countries. We have Turkish people, Turkish Muslims or related Muslims, and then what about refugees coming after the coup? So now I would like to ask Professor Egdūnas Račius to continue with comments about how can we see Turkish Islam in general and maybe Hizmet refugees in particular in Eastern European context.
All right. Hello, everyone. Won't take long, because if I do take long, then maybe people won't have time to ask their questions, or if they ask those questions, they may not wait until they get the answers. So when talking about Eastern Europe and Hizmet operations in this region, in the post-communist part of Europe, I would say that we speak less about refugees or expatriates turned immigrants. We first of all need to speak about the local Muslim populations, the autochthonous Muslim populations. Some of those populations are, if not entirely, but then heavily Turkish, for instance, in Bulgaria, where the overwhelming majority of the Bulgarian Muslims are Turkish speaking, well, ethnically Turks. In other countries, there may be not as many Turks or Turkish speaking Muslims, but there are those autochthonous communities who, well, because the Balkans used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, they, I'd say, cherish that Muslim heritage and the connections with Turkey. And I would say, and some of the people may disagree with me, and I'd look forward to a discussion here, but I'd say that until Hizmet had come to Eastern Europe, which is post Cold War, there was very little of Islamic support coming from Turkey. We may say first that until the fall of the communist regimes, there simply couldn't be enough of outside support, with a sort of conditional exception of Yugoslavia, where it was slightly different from the other communist bloc countries. But Turkey itself had not been willing to support even Turkish communities through the sort of religious prism. If anything, it was sort of national pride, nationalism, but not really religion. So I'd say that what happened, and it sort of coincided, that when the communist regimes fell in Eastern Europe and all the religious communities, including Muslims, could openly profess, could congregate, could publish, could do things, they would look forward to any support, and some of the support would come from the Arab countries. However, Turkey very soon overtook those other actors. We could say that it is actually Turkey that played the key role in reviving Islamic religiosity in not only in the Balkans, but mainly or chiefly in Balkans. And it then coincided that for a while, what was Turkish influence was actually to a very high degree Hizmet influence. And for a while, we could say and see that people in the communities, the local communities, would not be able to tell apart, is this Hizmet or is this Turkish state? The embassy would host Hizmet organized religious activities and so on. So it seemed for an outsider, certainly, so that when we speak about Turkish Islam in post-communist Eastern Europe, until the coup, that is, of course, that was mainly Hizmet Islam, or Hizmet version of Islam. And of course, we could discuss how it differs from other versions and so on, but I don't think this is time to do that. So, what you see is that Hizmet had been very active in promoting two things. One is sort of this religious awareness and an activity, but also maybe it was not its aim. I mean, Hizmet's aim may have not been this, but it did actually promote the sort of Turkish state, the Turkish vision. So now we can probably say that that Turkey as a state used Hizmet. It was, handy, was useful. Hizmet would probably, I just guess, would do it out of its own coffins, and the funding would come from their own communities, and the state would just simply use them. And we see that in many places, and in particular in Lithuania, actually. I could tell you this funny example where the local, and I mean local Tatar Muslim community would congregate in a small rented facility, apartment basically, in Vilnius, the capital city. And then it was the Hizmet, effectively, that offered its premises. So when the Muftiyat, well, now we have two Muftiyats, but the original Muftiyat, when it moved to those premises, no one really would make a difference. Is this Hizmet premises? Is this Turkish state or Turkish embassy premises? It's one and the same. And once the coup comes, we see that it is far from the same. And we all know too well that the Turkish communities, expatriate communities, also autochthonous communities like the Bulgarian Turkish community would just split into two. I wouldn't say equal parts. It turned out that the majority were not grateful to the Hizmet and sided rather with the, let's call it embassy or Erdogan or government side. But nonetheless, the split occurred throughout Eastern Europe and in Lithuania. This meant that the people, the Hizmet, people who actually welcomed the Muftiat, since the Muftiat chose to be with the embassy, so to say, the Hizmet people were just simply kicked out. So it's only then it becomes clear, oh, so Hizmet is not really Turkey or Turkish Islam as the state, the Turkish state promotes. And in the Lithuanian case, we really had it the worst way, where you might say that the side effect of the coup and the split in the Turkish sort of Islamic scene has led to a very, very, very grave split and animosity in the Lithuanian. When I say Lithuanian, I don't really mean ethnic Lithuanian. I mean mainly Tatar community. And now we have two rival muftiats who, well, I might even use the word hate each other openly, and they vilify each other. One muftiat is accused of being Hizmet or Gülenist, which it is not, of course, but it is on friendly terms with the Hizmet movement in Lithuania, with the school, other institutions that Hizmet runs or is part of. And the other, the new muftiat, the neo muftiat, is the one who is firmly with the Diyanet, let's call it, with the Diyanet. And I see that split here in Lithuania as actually not a temporary, apparently. It'll lead to long-term divisions. The Tatar community in Lithuania is tiny. There are around 1,500 Tatars in Lithuania who identify as Muslims. In general, in Lithuania, there are around, well, this is at least officially around 3,000 Muslims, but there are definitely more than that. But this is what the statistics suggest, and it's just 1,500 who identify as Tatar Muslims. And among them, that split has led to this institutional split, which has led to all sorts of headaches with the state, for instance, because the Lithuanian state, the legislation requires the state to recognize Sunni Muslim communities as quote unquote traditional to the country. Now, we have these two muftiats who are traditional, who, as I say, just accuse each other of all sorts of things and then belittle each other at every possible moment. So it's a very sad situation, this fallout, so to say. What does it have to do with the Hizmet? It has to do all with it, because it was Hizmet that had been perceived to be Turkish Islam in Lithuania, and until the coup, it seemed that everything is just, nice, smooth, friendly, and so on. So if we look at the broader picture in Eastern Europe, we see exactly the same patterns, where the community split and then the rivalry started, where the Turkish state would invest heavily, so to say, to have loyal following. And in most of the countries, actually, we might say that the Turkish state slash Diyanet have won. If I'm not wrong, it's not still the case in Albania, and then maybe in some other cases where we still have Hizmet movement operating publicly, having their own institutions and so on. Well, I think Bosnia would probably also be another country. In Lithuania, we do have Hizmet. It has survived, but well, and then the people from the community can also tell that they have kept a fairly low profile for obvious reasons. The prospects for Hizmet in Eastern Europe are not really very bright, at least not until things change in Turkey itself, to start with the government, either the government itself or the government's attitude, which then would translate into the Diyanet's attitude. I'm not saying that Diyanet and Hizmet will never be friends, partners, or whatever. I don't suggest that, but it's just doesn't seem to be the case there. And as long as it's not there, I don't really see any prospect for Hizmet to thrive in post-communist Eastern Europe, even if, as in the case of Lithuania, but not only Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia also, Hizmet people have been welcomed as refugees. So let me stop here so that we can have Q&A and discussion and whatever else, and then Ismail and me, depending on who of the two of us is addressed, would be more than willing to answer your questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for your comment and introduction on Hizmet within the Eastern European context. Ismail, would you like to add anything?
I think Professor Egdūnas has almost not entirely same, because every country is different, but that's exactly what has happened in this local community where I am in the Yorkshire. I'm saying in general in England as well, but there is a strong Islamic presence in here, so there's other things at play. It's not like one Tatar Diyanet sort of issue, but it also almost like remind me in one way my local community in Yorkshire, let's say, where I am currently. This is the other side that is emerging that requires maybe a lot of talk as well. Where I am in Huddersfield now making this talk, there wasn't a single person before. And this Sunday, again, in this premise, we will gather around 45, 50 people, because not everyone can make it. So what I'm trying to say is there is a huge number increase in here percentage-wise, but that's also forming, like most of them are refugees and some of them are still asylum seekers. The process takes time. And that's a new identity almost, at least much different than what it was before. As the professor rightly highlighted, it was so much similar, almost like as part of Turkish state or Turkish foreign ministry apparatus. God knows who was using who. That is the other question. Like it was so indistinguishable, and whether that is good or bad for a social movement is questionable as well. I would say a lot of creativity, a lot of activism, a lot of freedom area was actually diminished in that relationship. So Hizmet has now a room to breathe in terms of creating a new identity on its own terms. But of course, it's going to be very much affected by this newly arriving refugees and their way of engaging, because it can go two ways as well. I don't know how is the situation in Lithuania. People can get to ICE, establish closed communities, because they don't have a good relationship with wider Muslim communities, because there is a huge amount of propaganda. B, they have been persecuted still. It's a big agenda of the Turkish embassy and everywhere. Or if anyone wants to promote it into a higher position or a better position, they try to show off by this sort of a agenda follow-up so that Erdogan may consider them more valuable somewhere else. So in general, so it might get to ICE, and that would be a different story. And it might learn the language and integrate better. That might be a different story. I think it's an interesting intersection in everywhere, especially in the, I will still say, Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe. I haven't personally seen the situation on there, but yeah.
But I would react to this by saying that I think the situation, we shouldn't probably generalize and say profoundly different, Eastern and Western parts of Europe, but in particular with the autochthonous Muslim communities that have been turned by the states into effectively these national Muslim churches. And then I emphasize the word church. Think of these Muslim religious organizations like, in Bosnia, this Islamska Zajednica, it is a church. And their Rais al-Ulama is the, the bishop or the cardinal or whatever. So there the situation is different because it's also local politics of sorts playing there. In Western Europe, as you correctly said, and in the UK, that the spectrum of the forms of Islamic religiosity are, from Salafi through Tablighi, through whatever. You mentioned also the Bandis. So, it's a very different situation there, although I would not deny that in Western Europe, we also see attempts at churchification of Islam, but they mean different things there. So in Eastern Europe, and then as I suggested here in Lithuania, the Ministry of Justice had this problem because the constitution says, well, we recognize certain faith communities as traditional. That's faith communities. And then the law on religions says we recognize certain organizations as traditional. And then we have never had muftiyat in Lithuania. So muftiyats technically cannot be traditional. But the ministry can't do much about this because, well, these guys claim to be Sunni. Well, they're traditional, so their organizations are traditional. So, this sort of churchification thing works in a different way here in post-communist Eastern Europe, and post-communist is probably also meaningful to bear in mind because we have specific types of religious nationalism here that are not present, say, in the UK, Germany, or elsewhere.
I would ask or remind everybody that if you have questions, you can raise your hands, and I'm sure our speakers will try to answer them. And meanwhile, I'm thinking about Hizmet or Turkish Muslims in European countries and their relationship with other Muslims. What are the relationships? Are there any, I don't know, conflicts related to interpretation of Islam, related to how, for example, values of their host societies are understood, or they live quite separately and there are no interconnections?
I think I can start on that, if Professor, maybe it might, and from an English or British point of view, let's say, or what's happened here. First of all, there is like 4.5 million or maybe more Muslim in the UK. That is like quite a number. Of course, Hizmet is a small minority in there, or Turkish people in general is a small minority in there. I would assume in Germany the story would be different, or the implication would be different at least. What happened here is some part I can see that it probably happened in Lithuania as well, is that in that period, 2002 to let's say 2015, Hizmet movement, when they were almost acting like a part of the foreign affairs of Turkey, let's say, or at least they were recognized as close, and however you take it. I think at that time in England, for instance, all the relationships that the current government is abusing or using has been, almost majority of them have been introduced via Hizmet dialogue activities and other stuff. They were taken to Turkey, introduced to Turkish society and culture, maybe with conferences and other events, and among them are Muslims as well. And almost all of them, I'm talking about the Muslims now, not necessarily rest of them, have found Erdogan very charismatic in various ways, and as some sort of an Islamic point of refuge in every crisis, and would like to overlook everything else if they don't have to. And of course, and then there is an active use of, let's say, that state power in here, like for instance, sponsoring certain mosques and certain groups, and or and most recently the famous beautiful Cambridge Mosque, Tim Winter's Abdullah Muradu established. I think there is a Turkish state sponsorship there as well, sort of, and because Erdogan was there in the opening ceremony as well. So their relationship, like, does Hizmet knew Tim Winters before? Yes, they do. Probably they might have introduced him to Erdogan as well. And now what happened is, like, all those relationships in terms of Muslims, seems majority of them are siding for whatever that reason might be with Erdogan. And the way I see it is there is a chance that this might isolate further Hizmet movement, because there isn't a real counter challenge to establish those bridges back, because it doesn't happen only political persecution, it also happens, there is a religious language used as well. I'm sure Professor Egdūnas might have recognized it's almost what we call takfirism, calling each other or one side to another being infidel, or people who desert religion, which has implications in other parts of the world, let's say, but effectively turns you into a potential target or a victim for whoever wants to do something. I think there is a huge problem for Hizmet movement. There is an isolation is a big issue, and whenever any religious group in Islamic world have been successfully isolated like this, I'm not an expert on the topic, but the popular names that comes into my mind doesn't necessarily achieve to go back to that pre-crisis situation where they have a good relationship with the wider community. I think Hizmet movement has to, I know it's not the topic of this conversation, but has to be very careful about not to be totally isolated with other Muslims, have to have some bridges and some understanding, or contain this crisis at least as much as it can to a political sphere, but not extend it to wider social context. I can see people don't want to necessarily engage into other mosques, and they establish their own mosques and start praying together. It almost what the professor I was trying to what you were trying to probably say is the churchification process starts. Now let's say there is this group that and this is their masjid, and that's this group and that's their masjid, and they don't necessarily interact with each other. And Hizmet has been so far not ghettoized in that sense within Islamic communities as well, but I see there is a danger, especially in the UK, that it can ghettoize in terms of place of worship as well, if not careful.
I'd probably second what you said, Ismail. When we talk about Hizmet communities, we first of all, of course, think about these intra-Turkish, sort of developments. And as I had suggested, and it appears Ismail has also confirmed, that Hizmet had gotten too close to the state, put it this way. But it now is, I don't know whether I should use the word pariah, at least vis-a-vis or from the point of view of the state. But many of the Turkish religious movements have actually been in such a situation at one or another point. Think of Milli Görüş, for instance, and many others. Some of them may be more into the sort of Sufi side, others more into this sort of Islamist side. So, but there's a plethora. So within the Turkish Islamic scene, at least for the past, whatever, say 50 or so years, we have seen these waves, comings and goings of movements becoming sometimes closer, sometimes very, very kept very far from the state. So within the Turkish-speaking Muslim diaspora in Europe, I think what Ismail has said, but also many other developments are there, and this sort of isolation, either self-imposed isolation or marginalization by the others, it's not only possible, it has happened, we could say so. But if we now move beyond or outside of the Turkish speaking diaspora into the wider scene, there I'd say, Hizmet is just one among dozens, if not hundreds, of organizations, movements, communities, or what I call forms of Islamic religiosity. So in the context where it is not bullied by the state, like in Western Europe, for instance, it may, develop. It may, as you said, now being free, you may be more creative because there's, well, the state is breathing in a bad sense into your back, but then you don't really have to be loyal or to try and sort of suit what it expects. So in Western Europe, I'd say the prospects may be somewhat better in the sense that within the Turkish speaking communities, yes, this isolation, marginalization there, but within the wider ones, it all depends on how the movement, how the communities position themselves. Think of the Ahmadi communities. I mean, everyone else, every other Muslim would say, Ahmadis, these are not Muslims. But these have really been, trying hard, doing charity, going to the Lithuanian parliament, talking to the vice minister of foreign affairs, sometimes him talking, and it might even appear to some people that the vice minister has become an Ahmadi because, he's like in all these public events and so on. So, there you can do things. But in some of the Balkan countries where we have those established national Muslim churches, now, there you will be on the same level with, Wahhabis, Salafis, the bad ones in particular, since we have these, terms being attributed to the Hizmet movement as, terrorist and so on. So some of the people might just simply not want to be associated for whatever reason. So I think once again, the situation in Western and Eastern Europe may be fairly different, at least in some of the countries, and then the spectrum is wide enough so that we could probably see at the extreme ends very, very different developments. And I'm still talking about Hizmet communities. Thanks.
Thanks for comments. Anyone from the... Yes, we have a question in the chat. I'm reading from the chat. I would like to ask a question to Egdūnas. Should Hizmet be active in religious life in Lithuania?
When we talk about Lithuania, I would say that Lithuania is once again an exceptional case in a sense that people know very little about Islam. People have not seen Muslims. Well, even during the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-16, when Lithuania graciously accepted over 1,000 Syrian refugees, we, Lithuania, never managed to lure so many of the Syrians into Lithuania, but the 600 whom we lured into Lithuania, of these 600, at least 550 have left Lithuania. So not even refugees want to stay here. And so when it comes to the knowledge about Islam, there's little to know. And the communities, the Muslim communities, don't produce Islamic knowledge as knowledge in itself, or don't produce knowledge on the communities and Islam for public consumption. There are no academics, very few people who do research, who publish, and so on. So anyone and everyone in Lithuania, including Hizmet community, if they want the Lithuanian society to have a certain understanding, to start with, and some kind of understanding about Islam, but then a certain understanding of Islam, they should engage. So I would say that, since the scene is not really saturated with books or whatever, if it is the Hizmet community that, for instance, translates some bits of hadith, if we have certain translations into Lithuanian that are accessible, and there's no difference, online or otherwise, it's whatever format. But then the Lithuanians, most of the Lithuanians don't speak foreign languages, so they could read in Lithuanian, and they say, see, can they tell the difference? It's an Ahmadi community, it's a Hizmet community. They don't care. They, well, these guys are Muslim, and then look, they have translated, they have acquainted us. So my answer, short answer would be yes, absolutely. If they want to promote their version of the Islamic religiosity, how it differs from the others, that's an internal thing. But to shun away and to stay on sort of on the margins, yeah, that's an option. But then others will come in, and then we do have others. We have Muslim Brotherhood friendly. We have Salafis, even Lithuanians who have converted to Islam. A number of them are Salafis. They haven't really produced much yet, but once they do, then the Lithuanians will read in Lithuania about that particular version of Islam. So in this regard, I would say yes, Hizmet should consider this.
Because as I think, Lithuanian Hizmet community is working more on cultural projects or some social projects, but they don't present itself as a religious community to at least outside society.
It's their choice. It's their choice. I mean, I can't impose it. It's their choice. But the question was whether the community should be visible in the religious life, and then I'd say yes, because it's a free country, and no one would persecute them. Well, the embassy would not be happy about that, but it hasn't been happy for the past 6 whatever years. So it doesn't make any difference. So therefore, yeah, the social sort of activities, language teaching, these kind of things, yes, but there's this religious side that they may consider to make more public, but that's of course up to the community.
And then my question be to Ismail. This is showing kind of cultural side of Hizmet or social activism. Isn't it related to the way how at least Hizmet at least used to work? Because I've read that, for example, in the school projects, they stressed that religion is not emphasized too much.
Yes, I think there is a resonance in there. When I was doing that presentation, yeah, it is at the core you are a Muslim, and there's huge Turkish nationalism or Turkish luggage affects you and everything. But expression of this Islam has never been directly missionary way, let's say, or not in that context. I think there is a choice that Said Nursi made in the very early times, and Gülen repeated as well. There is this understanding every Muslim should teach Islam or promote Islam or propagate Islam. It's called dawah. And then you can see a lot of people, a lot of Muslims doing that, because that is a huge part of Islam, peaceful expansion of Islam, let's say, to other people. But in that dawah, there is, how can you express your religion in the best form? And previously, a lot of people used to think that people never heard about Islam. So let's say telling them about Islam, teaching them about or printing Quran, and telling them, literally doing tabligh, it's called, is one way of doing that. And Hizmet, since Said Nursi, has chosen another way, what we call temsil. So the idea is that temsil means representing, or rather than talking about something. Tabligh is a conversation that you have to tell people this is the final prophet of God and this and that, sort of like you have to explain them so they understand Islam, and so they have a choice whether they accept or not. Until then, maybe they're not even responsible. They're not even punishable by Allah in the afterworld if they never heard. There's a lot of discussion in that. But in very layman's terms, Gülen believes that there is enough information out there about Islam and people can access it easily. The big missing part is that people practicing Islam, meaning like we all say in our back of our cars, there used to be like stickers in Turkey, Islam is solution to all problems. So where is that? Let us see Muslims solving a problem. sort of like, or at least trying to solve a problem. So temsil comes in there, like that's why that Islamic knowledge of yours motivates you to do, okay, I'm a Muslim and I'm a vicegerent of God on earth. I am supposed to sort out problems, help, you know, his vision and whatever. And what can I do? What is the problems? Ignorance, poverty, hatred, this, or global warming. And what can I do? I can do my personal bit and my community bit and my local bit, and then an expansion of various social circles. And you will see partly this is the reason why Hizmet express always itself in social projects rather than religious projects, because religion is secondary in there and it's private. But what you do as a Muslim person matters more than what you say about Islam or what you teach about Islam, because your action remains longer. And there is one other side, one other reason for that. And if you have visited Turkey, religious expression wasn't really encouraged, let's say, in a very, very British way of putting that. It's heavily discouraged. In, I think it was 2004 or 5, when I went for my brother's military, he's a private, compulsory military service. A month of training later, they are supposed to sworn in as after their education. And it's a big stadium, thousands of soldiers and thousands of families. And my mom was wearing headscarf and she wasn't allowed there. So that's sort of like a community in 2004 when Erdogan was even in power, traumatized in the sense that you can't even attend your child's military service ceremony because you're wearing an Islamic symbol on your head. Hence, you should stay outside of the thingy. That makes another mark, I think, in every maybe Muslim community in Turkey, one way or another, but definitely on Hizmet movement to find a way of engaging with society, anything other than Islamic, let's say, premise as well, you know, social premises and other ways to engage with people. I think that might be repeating itself partly as well. You know, it's safer, better, easier, or it's the learned behavior to live Islam in your private home and come in as a teacher, as a social project worker.
Okay, that probably explains some behavior of some, at least, Hizmet communities. Thank you for explanation. And we have another question for Egdūnas put in the chat. Do you think if here in Lithuania, being the voice, such innocent people of Turkey will endanger the future of Hizmet movement? As far as we know, the two countries have no good relationships.
Well, all right. I might say that the two states, Lithuania and Turkey, have not had good relations for the better part of the past decade. And you may recall that Turkey was blocking the Baltic states initiative in the NATO, a major one, recently, just a couple of years ago. And I should not use non-academic words here, but the Lithuanian politicians were very, very angry with the Turkish government for not allowing this motion to pass in the NATO. Eventually it did. So no love lost here. Now, the Turkish state was very upset when after the coup attempt, it had demanded that Lithuania turn in the Hizmet people residing in Lithuania, and rather than doing that, Lithuania welcomed them, allowed them to stay, and some of them apparently got the refugee status. So that irritated the Turkish government profoundly. So the two states are not on friendly terms. Well, some might say that there are very few European states, governments that are on friendly terms with Turkey for many reasons, not only related to Hizmet, of course. So that's one thing. The other thing is that Of course, it is the communities themselves who are to decide how visible and in what ways visible they want to be in a particular country. Myself, coming from sort of as an outsider, I'm not a community member. I'm not actually a community member of any community, religious, I mean, then I don't know whether it could be of risk to actually be yourself or show your sort of identity, your belonging more than Hizmet has been doing. So now jeopardizing its future, it is for the community to decide how much it wants to be visible, but I don't really see any obstacles here in Lithuania from the point of view or from the side of the government or the public. Yes, we know that the rival Muftiat would all the time be not happy. It would talk to the embassy would not be happy, but they can't really do not much, they can't do anything. So of course, individually speaking, people may choose not to be publicly identifiable or seen for security reasons because they have their families and so on back in Turkey. So that's understandable. But generally speaking, the society, from if we think of how the society operates and then how it views Islam and so on, then for Hizmet there's nothing to fear. Even Salafis are okay. So Hizmet is certainly not of this kind of Islamic religiosity, so that that would not be acceptable to the wider society. So therefore, I don't really see that one needs to sort of lay low because one may jeopardize the communities or the entire movement's future. But well, as I said, I'm speaking as an outsider, and of course, those people who are inside might say, "Oh, come on, you don't know what we feel or how we feel, and why we act the way we do." So, of course, I might not be imposing my understanding over them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, it's already 1 hour and a half, so as the time of our event, so we should think about probably our last questions, if our listeners have. And then my last question would be, we were talking about Hizmet, first of all, as a Turkish Islamic movement, a version of Turkish Islam. But then through acting in other countries, Hizmet now has some members from other countries. So, for example, what would you think about this type of Islam as Islam for local, for example, Lithuanian converts? And
I thought that the question would be wider, but since it was now about the Lithuanian converts, well, the community members may tell us, and I know that they are here present, so if anyone wants to jump in and tell whether there are the non-Muslims, I mean, the people who were born non-Muslim who converted to Islam and chose to convert to this form of religiosity and be members of the Hizmet community. I'm not aware. I know that the majority of those who convert to Islam tend to be, well, not a majority, but many tend to be sort of revivalist leaning, closer to the Muslim Brotherhood type of Islam, or Salafis, as I said. So, but I haven't come across any Lithuanian, or for that matter, Latvian, if you want, or have to be fair, any convert who has chosen Hizmet. But the community would know better. But is that possible? And how is Hizmet Islam different from other forms of religiosity throughout the world? It's once again a very, very sort of loaded topic, and then surely it's not only Turkish. When you think about Albania, and in Albania you have so many Albanians, ethnic Albanians who are part, I wouldn't necessarily say the movement itself, but they had been educated in Hizmet universities. I think it's Bedar University, and then they have been serving in the community and so on and so on. So, they are probably members if you want. So it's not entirely Turkish anymore, that's for sure. And then in Central Asia and then in Eastern Africa and elsewhere. So, but it's not that people would convert from non-Islam to Hizmet Islam. It's rather that Muslims would find that what Hizmet offers is what is acceptable or desirable by them. Thank you.
Thank you. And in a broader European context and the changing communities or countries where now Hizmet communities exist, Ismail, what would you think about Turkishness of Hizmet and Islam it promotes?
I think I was in Eastern Africa recently, so there was an eye-opening part of that to see, especially in Tanzania, almost 95% of people actively managing, doing groundwork and everything, in terms of the top level manager to the grassroots activities. Almost 95% of them were non-Turks. Now, it's very, very strange thing to see in practice. And some of them are very young. I was a visitor in a dormitory, and I think the dormitory principal was 24-year-old. So that's like very early years of Hizmet activism, the youth, the dynamism I felt very, very strongly there, which actually in most of the cases grow out. They get older as the Hizmet grow, and the action and reaction and activism, everything actually grow old with the movement. With this crisis, it pushed a certain Hizmet identity, not a certain Hizmet identity, but at least it made, first time in Turkish sense, Turkish government now effectively claiming almost 600,000 people are from this group. In a society where you're not expressing your religion very openly, even in Turkey. And it's very hard for a lot of people to come to terms with that and make some, acknowledge that this is part of my identity. And even when you ask someone, when I'm asked, for instance, in the interviews and stuff, it's hard to admit that you are a member of a Hizmet group, because there is some now political outcomes or punishments that might be like recently all my non-existing financial assets have been frozen and confiscated by Turkish government according to presidential decree, and my name was on there because I'm just talking about this issue. So there is that sort of a consequence related to it. But because of that pressure, because of that force, some of the things that naturally happen over 20 years happen in 5 years now. For instance, in Central Asia, a lot of people graduated from this school. They had sense of a spirituality, and some of them chose that, okay, I want to actually I find this meaningful, and I want to be a teacher and work and take part in this. And that happened over maybe 20, 30 years. But in the last 5 years, in certain countries, it's not possible to stay as a Turkish person. So it enforced, like in Pakistan, almost overnight. A lot of people, a lot of Pakistanis found themselves in managerial positions or Hizmet positions that they, as teachers, as principals and others. And almost overnight, they had to take over and try to manage that, and that of course enforced a certain discussion in there. In Western Europe, the emerging new identity is a bit more centered around refugees still, and I find it very, not very, let's don't exaggerate this, in a normal sense, very ghettoized because of the traumas, I think. it's very strange. It has always been, because of, I blame this for Germany. Every action, every activities in where there is a lot of Turkish community, like Germany, Netherlands, and maybe in London, is always designed around those Turkish people. In the rest of the world, all Hizmet activities would be designed around the needs of the social, let's say, Malaysians and Central Asians and this and that. But when you come here, you know, it's that mentality automatically works a bit like more closed, let's say, maybe self-confidence issue, maybe some other issues. So you don't see inclusion of that locals yet successfully in here. Like, you have almost 99% of your graduates in Kazakhstan are Kazakh, because that is natural, because you set up a school there. But in London, the school in here, even after this crisis and a lot of people removed their kids because they sided with government, I think maybe 50% of them are still Turks and the other 50% is local kids. Maybe that is increasing. In Germany, I have witnessed from 90% Turkish to 60% Turkish, the rest German, and then 60% to German. I don't know what is the situation recently, because it is almost, with Erdogan's pressure, it's forced these people to be open to the local community of Germany, let's say, to German people, and challenge. And then probably it will bring a next level once these people are graduated and they have a better understanding on what's going on and whether they want to be affiliated with it or support it. But the first step was not voluntary in that sense. But in Tanzania, you know, partly because people can't stay there longer than their passport's expiry date and this and that, there is a successful transition happened in 5 years. In Kenya, a partial so, and we don't know how it is going to move. I talked about this issue on a video blog yesterday, and someone from Russia texted me and say, well, I would like to actually consider going and working in, so I'm a Russian graduate, I guess. Can you put me in touch with someone? I'm not the connection person, but you can see that fluidity already started everywhere anyway. I hope it comes to Europe and we see Lithuanians involved, but for that, it has to open up itself. I don't know what is the situation, but to serve Lithuanians. If the school or supplementary school in here aims, tomorrow there'll be some activities, some supplementary school activities in here, but all the customers or beneficiaries are Turkish children from refugee families. If it was to offer that free service to wider Huddersfield community in here, I can see it can help a lot of people. It can heal a lot of teachers' psyche in here as well, who are traumatized by giving something back to community, feel better and valued and whatever. But also a lot of people have antisocial behavior problems and this and that. They may benefit from this. And then you would see that change, maybe Europeans coming into it. But there is a barrier, I think, partly mental, partly old behaviors. It's not there yet. Sorry to take too long to answer a very complicated, for me at least, a question. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answer. And I can see our participants are leaving, and maybe that is a good sign that we should stop here. So thank you both for agreeing to share your thoughts in this public lecture of the Lithuanian Society for the Study of Religion. I hope that your thoughts were interesting both for the Hizmet community that gathered to listen to your presentations, as well as for Lithuanians and other Eastern Europeans who joined us today. Thank you again, and I think that's it for tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you
Have a nice
very
weekend,
much,
everyone.
Thank you very much for
Thank
inviting me
you.
as well. And nice to meet you, Professor Egdūnas.